So good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nicola Setari, and I'm an agent of dOCUMENTA 13. Today we begin the philosophy seminar, What is Thinking? Or A Taste That Hates Itself, that is directed by Professor Christoph Menke and is organized in collaboration with the head of department of dOCUMENTA 13, Chus Martinez. It's a very sort of special moment for us because this is a long-term project, a long-term seminar, we could say, that cuts across the 100 days of dOCUMENTA 13. We'll be meeting every Monday here at the Ständehaus for a public lecture with the invited philosopher, and then in a more closed session for a seminar in the Friedrichianum at the Zwerenturm on Tuesdays at 11. So it's a two-day, it has two-day sessions, Monday and Tuesdays. I would like to also, on behalf of Chus Martinez, who could not be present today, as she is in Kabul, installing the exhibition or the edition of dOCUMENTA 13, which is opening this week there, to thank and very warmly thank Professor Menke for conceiving this seminar and engaging in making it possible. We are very honored that this could be one of the key projects, not just in the public program of dOCUMENTA 13, this is also, I think, very important to understand, but also really part of the exhibition in a way, because the closed seminar takes place in the Friedrichianum. And as a matter of fact, if you've seen the exhibition, there are scientists invited in dOCUMENTA, but there are also philosophers as actual participants in the project. And I think that's something quite important to underline. I will, of course, leave it to him to give an introduction to the seminar and to some of the ideas that have led to its conception and to making it possible. I would like to mention that he is a professor of practical philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and a member of the editorial boards of the magazines Constellations and Polar. His publications include Tragic Play, Irony and Theater, from Sophocles to Beckett, 2009, Craft of 2008, and Reflections of Equality of 2006. I would also like to give a very warm welcome, also on behalf of the Maybe Education Public Programs Department, to Emmanuel ALLOA, who is our first invited philosopher, and who will be giving a lecture this evening on Aisthesis, or why there is no thinking without phantasms. I do have to mention, sorry, I was forgetting, the notebook, if you are not familiar with this project, the 100 Notes, 100 Thoughts notebook series, for which number 10, there is a contribution by Professor Menke on the aesthetics of equality. I'll now give a short note on Emmanuel ALLOA's bio. Emmanuel studied philosophy, history, and art history. From 2008 to 2011, he was a researcher at the NCCR Iconic Criticism in Basel. Since 2012, he is assistant professor of cultural theory and cultural philosophy at the philosophy department at the University of St. Gallen. Among his areas of interest are phenomenology, New French philosophy, and image theory. In Paris, where he taught since 2005 at the art department at the University of Paris 8, he directs the third season, I understand now, of the philosophical dialogues of the Scène Nationale de Gennevilliers. And among his publications are La résistance du sensible, Merleau-Ponty, Critique de la transparence, and I translate from the German, The Diaphanous Image, Sketches of a Medial Phenomenology of 2011. I stop here. I'm very happy you're all with us today, and again, really invite you to regularly participate and engage with the seminar, because we will sort of learn and challenge on the way how to do philosophy within dOCUMENTA 13 and in the closed session as well. If you haven't done it yet, to be able to participate in the closed session, you need to visit the website and sign up. So please take advantage. It's only a limited number of participants. And I give now the floor to Professor Menke for the introduction to the seminar. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, good evening also from my side. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to be here and to welcome you also in the name of Chus Martinez. As you heard, she cannot be with us tonight, but will be here at the following, most of the following occasions. I don't really want to present my own thoughts on the question, what is thinking, because Chus Martinez and I will do this in the last seminar, so in September, but I just thought I owe you an explanation for the title, and especially maybe for the subtitle, which might sound strange. So let me briefly explain what we mean, especially with the subtitle in this context. So the idea of this series of lectures and seminars is to explore what thinking is. So that process or that activity, one might be tempted to say, that leads from perception and feelings through imagination and reflection to judgment, and then again beyond judgment. But is this, and this is the starting point in a certain sense of the question we want to raise, is this then an activity, as I just said, at all, or to court? Or is there an essentially passive moment or element in thinking? An event, one also might be tempted to say, of being grasped, even determined by something from the outside, of finding oneself in a state of excitement or even enthusiasm or despair or disgust. This is the question that the subtitle of our series is meant to raise. It refers to a passage in Adorno's Minima Moralia, where he speaks about or writes about taste or aesthetic taste. Let me quote you this passage from the Minima Moralia in English. Sorry. Adorno writes there, "Taste is the most accurate seismograph of historical experience. Unlike almost all other faculties, it is even able to register its own behavior. Reacting against itself, it recognizes its own lack of taste." Yeah? So aesthetic taste, Adorno says, reacts against itself and recognizes its own lack of taste. It is precisely the nerves, die Nerven, this is in German, most highly developed aesthetically, that now find self-righteous aestheticism intolerable. So this is a quote or a thought by which we were fascinated when we started to think about this seminar. According to Adorno, aesthetic taste as a kind of judgment, and thus all judgment to a certain degree, is self-righteous. Taste is self-righteous insofar as taste, as it tries to say what's right or wrong or what's true or false. But the mode of judging, or the mode of taste that Adorno calls aesthetic, has the further capacity, and that's the interesting move here, has, according to Adorno, the further capacity to react against itself. So taste is not just self-righteous form of judgment, but a form of judging that cannot stand, cannot tolerate its own self-righteousness and reacts against itself. Or, to be more precise, Adorno thinks to have aesthetic taste means to allow your own nerves to react or to protest even against one's own self-righteousness with which one judges. Another formula of Adorno's for this is, in the same brief passage from the Minima Moralia, repugnance against subjectivism. The German expression is Widerwille. So to say, I mean, in some sense, we can only say this in German. Adorno meint, ästhetischer Geschmack ist immer ein Geschmack, ein Urteilen wider Willen. Also wir urteilen, aber wir urteilen nur richtig, wenn wir widerwillig urteilen. Also so, dass wir im Urteilen einen Widerwillen gegen unser eigenes Urteilen entwickeln. So repugnance against the subjectivism that is involved in any act of judgment, in any act of taste. So aesthetic taste, to sum this up, is judgment that reacts against itself, that is repugnant judgment. And the question of this series of thinking, of seminars and lectures is if and how one can maybe transfer this thought of Adorno's about aesthetic judgment and aesthetic taste to the idea of thinking. Is there an aesthetic mode of thinking? This is one way of putting this question. A thinking that is aesthetic precisely by allowing and even soliciting the reaction of one's own nerves, as Adorno says, against one's own subjectivism, by which one tries to control one's own thinking. So a thinking that is repugnant against its own constitutive subjectivism. An action maybe of the subject that implies the counter-reaction of one's own sentiments, of one's own feelings, maybe even of one's own body. So this series, What is Thinking, does not so much as to discuss this question in an abstract way, in a general and abstract way, but rather we have invited a number of people whom we expect and we trust to be able to perform such a mode of thinking that we have in mind here in an exemplary way, to exercise this with respect to all kinds of subject matters, namely aesthetic subject matters or artistic ones, social ones, technological ones, political ones, and so on. So the idea is to explore a form of thinking that might be called aesthetic precisely in that sense that it is a form of thinking that solicits and allows and solicits a certain kind of counterforce in itself that comes from maybe a pre-rational dimension of subjectivity. And we thought that the best way to do this is, as Nicola already said, to do this in two very different formats. So in public lectures like tonight, where, of course, there's always only limited space and time for interaction between the public, the audience, and the lecturer. And therefore, we thought we should have a very different other format, namely a truly seminar format. So a format where we discuss together and we read together texts. We'll do this tomorrow morning, a close reading of certain texts that Emmanuel ALLOA has provided for us. And so where there is a chance for those of you who want to get deeper, much deeper into this topic, into these questions of discussing for the classical 90 minutes, right, which is a seminar and the length of a football game also, so that seems to be a good time frame. So these questions more closely. And now we are very much looking forward to the talk by Emmanuel ALLOA. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicola, for your kind presentation. Thank you very much to Övül, Anna, and many others whom I can't name now who made all of this possible. And thank you especially to Chus and to Christoph Menke for this beautiful proposal to introduce maybe something like a gap into a system which sometimes rotates into circular mode, and a gap which, as Christoph Menke just outlined, might be based on repugnancy, Widerwillen, or at least something like a doubt about the possibility of reintroducing art and its experience into something like the circularity of judgment. What I would like to do today is to outline a possible other approach to these issues and these matters from a point of view which might seem anachronistic, which might seem far away, which is, I don't know if it is pre-rational, but it is definitely pre-modern, and hence comes from a time where the aesthetic sphere as such was not established in its autonomy. This brings about a number of problems, also of historical nature, but it has a major advantage because it frees us of a series of hypotheses that have been formed by an aesthetic regime. I will come back to this later on. What is thinking? This was the question we were confronted with. What is thinking? I think 12 of us were asked this question, and Aisthesis is my provocative answer. Aisthesis. Now I know that this answer might not sound so provocative to your ears as it, especially here in Kassel, as it probably sounded to Western tradition, to Western philosophy, to Western theology. What has thinking to do with aisthesis? What has thinking to do with sensory perception? Not much, as it were. Despite the metaphorical analogy, the eyes of the mind do not see in the same way as those of the body, rather the opposite. Let me just check if you have... Okay. To Socrates, it was only after death that the soul, freed from the shackles of the body to which it had been so long chained, that it regains true vision again, or as the Greeks say, theoria, contemplation. The true theory is that of the gods. Playing on a false etymology, the ancients like to relate theorein, looking, contemplating, the highest of human activities, to the existence of the gods, of the theoi, who, unflustered by their bodies, would contemplate the course of things as from afar. To have a true insight through thinking is thus to overlook what the senses provide us with. Theon, horan, from which theorein comes, literally means to look at sensible things as if on a stage, and the word thea, appearance, has the same root as our modern word theatre. Theon, horan, though, means, yes, contemplating a spectacle, but not in terms of pure sensorial appearance, but rather in terms of the outline, the form, dismissing the contingent, accidental, and thus literally hazardous material side. Or if we want to use another vocabulary, no media specificity in the modernist sense in this godlike theoretical gazing. In order to understand what a rectangle is, we should rather not look at this or that rectangle, as that won't help much. Establishing what a rectangle is requires no specific perceptive faculties, and it is rather a hindrance to know that the rectangle is a foot long, that it has been drawn on cardboard, or that it represents a black square on white ground. Thinking, so a long-standing and influential tradition has it, can do without aisthesis, and indeed, these two faculties have long been opposed, noises and aisthesis, thinking and perceiving, along a divide, a continental rift, I would be tempted to say, between the sensible and the intelligible, the aistheton and the noeton, a divide that, albeit in different ways, runs from Parmenides to scholasticism, from Neoplatonism till, yes, Kant. Now you might say that all of this does not affect us anymore, and contemporary art is the best example for the overcoming of such an opposition. I would not be so affirmative. But let's see if we come to that later. In the meantime, let's just briefly recall you that the person to whom one customarily refers back to when legitimizing aesthetics as a specific realm where rationality appears in sensible form, Alexander Gottfried Baumgarten, the so-called founder of aesthetics in the 19th century, did very little to overcome this divide, rather the opposite. While he was indeed the author of the first treatise of aesthetics, though aesthetics is here to be understood in its original etymological sense, that is, the study of that which belongs to aisthesis, to sensory experience, and he devoted text to specific arts, such as poetry, his project still perpetuates the old Platonic divide between the intellectual things and the sensory things. So I hope you can read that up there. So this is from his meditations pertaining to some matters concerning poetry from 1735, and you see this older position, Platonic opposition he's recalling. The noeta are the objects of logic, while the aistheta are the object of the episteme aesthetike, in other words, of aesthetics, which is this new science he's founding. But the new science Baumgarten is founding, which is so often drawn upon as a witness, as a testimony for this overcoming of intellectualism, he is himself following the lines of this deep divide between the sensible and the intelligible. So what is then thinking? The answers given respectively by the poet and the thinker might not exactly match. In a collection of poems published by the Surrealists' internal publishing house in 1928, a collection entitled Défense de Savoir, Paul Éluard writes this short but compelling verse: Les images pensent pour moi. Images think for me, or maybe rather a more accurate translation would be, images think in my place, in my stead. According to the surrealist doctrine of the écriture automatique, the poet has to become a blank slate, an open receptacle, pure medium for the wandering images that traverse his mind. La mémoire rabat les cartes. Memory shuffles the cards, Éluard adds, signaling that whatever comes to the writer's mind comes from without, from the past, from the senses, from others, from tradition, but in any case is not stirred by his active will. It is not the poet who thinks, rather, he is being thought. On me pense, Rimbaud famously stated. I am being thought. In a way, the poet's subjectivity needs to be absent in order for this work of images to come about. Only by letting go, the images can think in the poet's stead. Does philosophy think that way too? Can philosophy think that way too? When he publishes the collection of poems in 1928 under this wonderful polysemic title, Défense de Savoir, which, as you know, both means prohibition of knowledge, of knowing, and also defense of knowing, the praise of knowing, Paul Éluard chose as a frontispiece a painting sketch he had directly bought, among others, in Rome in winter 1923 from the hands of a painter who greatly loved him, Giorgio de Chirico. The painting chosen bears the title Il poeta e il filosofo, the poet and the philosopher, and is dated by de Chirico to the year 1913. What we see, what you see, is a room opening on what we imagine to be one of those metaphysical urban scapes the painter has used us to, a room with two busts seen from the back, and which we imagine to be the busts of the poet on the left and that of the philosopher in white marble, just as Socrates' statue at Plato's Academy on the right. What is more interesting now is that this sort of side-by-side paragone between the thinker and the poet is what they are both looking at, the easel at the other end of the room. Is it a painter's canvas of which only the black undercoat would be visible? One could think maybe of Whistler's nightly visions of the Thames River. Or is it rather blackboard dashed with yet a few traces of yellowish chalk? Or shall one give it a more radical reading, possibly even metaphysical reading? What if that board on the easel were the blank tablet that both the surrealist écriture automatique is referring to and philosophy when talking about the soul? As indeed, the modernist gesture of radical erasure, from Malevich to Rauschenberg's Erase de Kooning, and the return to the empty canvas as something like the 0 degree of pictoriality, is in itself a late reverberation of an old topos of philosophy, the topos of the tabula rasa, of the blank slate as a metaphor for the soul. In order for the soul to receive impressions from the outer world, it literally needs to be receptive. In order to be informed, shaped by forms, it needs to be formless itself. The metaphor of the soul as a blank slate or tablet, which we find in early modern philosophy and in the British empiricists such as John Locke. So obviously we don't have any of those wax tablets from antiquity anymore. So this is the tablet without what I'm interested in, wax, which due to its plasticity, is also that which does not resist to time. So Locke says, let us suppose that in the beginning the mind is what is called a white sheet, without any characters, without any ideas. This idea goes back to medieval Aristotelianism. The Persian philosopher Ibn Sina, better known in the West as Avicenna, argues that the human intellect at birth is rather something like a tabula rasa, a pure potentiality, which will only later receive its imprint through time and education. The formula I'm using here is the Latin formula, since Avicenna was translated from Arabic to the West right away, and this is the formula which was used to translate Avicenna, tabula rasa. This is the word the formula which is then has then entered our vocabularies up to the idea of the tabula rasa of the avant-gardes. So, while this formula has been introduced as a translation of Avicenna, Avicenna himself is only appropriating himself of a metaphor which he did not invent himself, but goes back to Aristotle himself in his treatise on the soul. This treatise, which we know under various titles, so the Greek supposed title is Peripsyches, and the Latins refer to it as De Anima. A text which has undoubtedly been one of the most influential texts in the history of Western thinking. In the fourth chapter of the third book, this treatise has 3 books. In the fourth chapter of the third book, which is a chapter we will go into more depth tomorrow in the workshop for those who have the patience to go into it. In the fourth chapter, Aristotle compares the part of the soul responsible for thinking, the nous in Greek, the intellect, to wax tablet. The word is grammateion, on which nothing is actually written. Yeah. So this is the quote from De Anima. The intellect, the nous, is like a writing tablet, a grammateion, on which nothing is actually written. Now, you probably know that the Greeks did not write on paper. They wrote on papyrus and more often even on tablets made of wax, which, just like a hypermodern tablets today, could be infinitely reused for displaying new forms and words. Similarly to the tablet, the intellective soul has thus the capacity to host an infinite number of appearances, to literally take on an innumerable series of forms. Unlike the marble, from which you may only chisel one form, a poet, a philosopher, the wax refers to plasticity, which is that of the mind. When one idea comes to my mind, it is not going to be the last and definite one, and many others may come to my mind, sometimes even completely contradictory ones. The thinking or intellective soul may thus not be determined in any way if it is to receive all those forms. It is uninformed, or informe, as Georges Bataille liked to call it, with the term Rosalind Krauss and Yves Alain Bois have then worked out with relation to modern art in the post-avant-gardes. Yet there is a certain contradiction in Aristotle's metaphor, which was noticed as early as with the late antique commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias, one of the earliest commentators of Aristotle. Alexander says, the soul is not some particularly receptive matter, as the wax tablet comparison suggests. As a matter of fact, it cannot be a matter at all. So the soul should not be compared to a wax tablet, to an object. It should rather be compared to a state of the tablet. It is not a grammateion, it should rather be described as, with this strange word, epiteideiotes. So what does that mean, epiteideiotes? What we see here is a position which, in a way, is at the core of Aristotelianism and is, as such, anti-Aristotelian. We find a position within Aristotle's thought which is anti-hylomorphic. What is hylomorphism? Hylomorphism is the duality of matter and form. This is a duality we have learned to be familiarized through Aristotelianism. So Aristotle is the one who has theorized this distinction of form and matter, of hyle and morphe, of matter and form, morphe, morphology. So this hylomorphic divide, a position, is one which is precisely undermined by what comes here, which is the specific disposition of the wax tablet. The wax tablet is not about a specific size, is not about a specific depth, it is not how we hold it in our hands. The only important thing is not about its color. The only important thing about the wax tablet is that it needs to be, it needs to have this epiteideiosis, so we can translate it as preparedness, suitedness. Thomas Aquinas will refer to it as preparatio. So the wax tablet, as you know, has to be prepared in order to be worked upon, just as the artist prepares the grounding of his canvas in order for the canvas to become the receptacle of appearances, of forms, of colors and lines. This wax tablet has to be prepared in order to become, again, this pure receptive matter. And we've seen before, maybe you can see it even from where you are, this is what is left of the tablet, which has survived, one of the few tablets that have survived today. And we see that in a very Freudian sense, something has left its imprint, has left its mark down there, because through the layer of wax, something of the stylus went down, and there are letters. You can read some of those letters down there. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this metaphor Freud uses to describe the structure, the psychic structure, as being structures like the Wunderblock, this game, which I don't know if it still exists today, but at the time of Freud, it was indeed still made with wax, and there were these two layers, and by desolidarizing one layer from the other, it was possible to start all over again for the children, for the child to draw again. But the point of Freud is that while there is this superficial level which is erased and allows for the psyche to receive new impressions, there is a deeper level on which things remain inscribed, and this is, of course, the time of the unconscious. So what you see here is something like the optical unconscious of the Greeks on this tablet here, without the wax. But the whole point is obviously not this one, but what is the wax? What is the nature of the wax, and what does it tell us about the soul? So Alexander of Aphrodisia says it is about epiteideiotes, and the Arab commentators will then use a word which is interesting, because when it is translated back into Latin, this is this istidad is translated back into Latin, is then simply translated with disposition. There would be a lot to say about this word too. We can do that later if you're interested. So, what does it mean to be virtually capable of taking in anything? What does it mean for the soul to be receptive? A passage in the De Anima reads the following strange assertion. The soul is, in a certain fashion, all the beings. Very strange passage. The soul is, in a certain fashion, pause, all the beings. So the soul has to assimilate, to become like the things, to become a thing, to become the very thing, and yet to be different. It is this as if, the pause, this modalizing little word Aristotle adds, that is what it's all about. So the soul has to become like the thing it receives, and yet it does not become the thing as such. What I'm interested is this like, this in a fashion of pause. The intellectual assimilation is thought by Aristotle in a very literal fashion. So assimilation means to assimilate something, to assimilate a mental content, means to become like the object, taking over its appearance, or rather its form. Thinking a stone is thus to become a stone, or to be more precise, to become like a stone. When we say we have a stone in mind, we do not exactly have a mineral at the bottom of our souls. We have rather an appearance of the stone. It is present in its outer form. Aristotle then introduces another comparison. The soul is, he says, like a hand. It is a hand, like a hand, because it is malleable, it is supple. In order for it to grasp the object, it has to adapt to it, to bend around it. Taking a shape then amounts to taking over a shape. And nevertheless, and this is the essential point, the hand which palpated an object never loses the ability to palpate other ones. But the analogy has its obvious limits. Since the sense of touch presupposes the physical presence of what it touches, the hand will never touch the concept of red or the idea of freedom, and inversely, thinking does not reach out to this immediately physically present stone, but rather to its concept, to the stoniness of the stone, to the being stone of the stone. This gap between sensory intuition based on presence and thinking based on a conceptual abstraction has been described by many philosophers, and some, like Kant, have even turned it into an unbridgeable one. Let me quote a famous passage from the Critique of Pure Reason. So, Kant explains that there are basically two sources for knowledge. Two originally sources, one being the receptive capacity to take in representations. This is what he calls the receptive faculty of receiving impressions. And the other faculty, which is to know an object through these representations, and that is the spontaneity of the concepts. So all knowledge can be brought down to these two elements, intuition and concept. What Kant describes as two sources, and he sometimes also refers to it as two roots of knowledge, needs to converge. And then he says, thoughts without content, famous passage, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. So what do we do in this situation of these two parallel faculties, these two parallel roots, these two parallel sources? Well, Kant, as you know, will introduce a third faculty, a third mediating faculty, that which he calls Einbildungskraft, or imagination, which precisely bridges the gap and through the process of the so-called schematism gives the concept its content and the intuitive impression its structure. My point is not at all to go into the details, quite complex details of Kantian philosophy, and especially of the mechanism of the schematism, but to highlight why on this Kantian backdrop, imagination has often been read as third synthesizing faculty, which is now finally capable of overcoming the rift between aistheta and noeta, this divide I had been initially talking about between the sensible and the intelligible. The influence of the Kantian theory of imagination on modernity and all its later transformations cannot be overstated. It thus appears less surprising if such a reading has also been retroactively applied to earlier theories of imagination, such as that of Aristotle. We will see in a moment why this Kantian reading of Aristotle is tempting, and yet, I think, thoroughly misleading, and why we may find in his treatise on the soul the sketch for another thinking of and thinking with images, whose fertility for contemporary issues yet remains to be uncovered. Let's proceed step by step. In the third book on the treatise of the soul, we find this startling passage. So again, this is the mediation provided by imagination, Einbildungskraft. And now the strange passage, and which in Greek reads, Dio udepote noi an eu phantasmatos he psyche. The classical translation reads, this is why the soul never thinks without images. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of images are at stake here? What are those images the soul thinks with? Do we face an inversion of the Kantian assertion according to which an I think, ich denke, needs to be accompanying all my representations? Das Ich denke muss alle meine Vorstellungen begleiten können. Is this assertion simply reversed here, turning that into a new assertion? My representations must accompany all my thinking. As a matter of fact, the modern notion of the image in terms of representation is inadequate to give an account of the Greek term, which is the term you read there, which is phantasmata, phantasmatos. In order to avoid too many anachronistic associations, I'd rather suggest to stick to the most possible literal translation. Never does the soul think without phantasms, which is simply the subtitle of my talk. Now, what is a phantasm? Certainly not a fancy fantasy or a projection in the psychoanalytic sense, which would both side with what Kant calls the productive imagination, which invents that which is not the case, as opposed to the mere reproductive imagination, which only presents again that what was present to the senses before. Aristotle's phantasma, of which the word phantasia is derived, is not restricted to imagining that which is not the case, or that which is not the case anymore, or maybe even that which will be the case. He also opposes in these very passages to those pre-Socratic philosophers who think that any appearance is necessarily true. Aristotle's whole point, and that's why Castoriadis, whom we'll be reading tomorrow, or you might be reading before the session of tomorrow, which would be better, will consider that he literally discovered the that's why Castoriadis, Cornelius Castoriadis, who will also be part of the reading notes tomorrow night at the reading circle at 6 or 7, Castoriadis will consider that Aristotle literally discovered what Castoriadis calls the radical imaginary. And that is that fantasia and its visual images, the phantasmata, are neither on the side of what is the case, nor on that which is not the case, but lies beyond the opposition of true or false. Indeed, in a preceding chapter of the De Anima on the Soul, Aristotle had distanced himself from his teacher Plato,
whose criticism of Fantasia rested on the following basic assumption. Fantasia is appearance plus judgment. Hence the statement about how things are, doxa, an opinion in which we are caught. As Aristotle makes clear, opinion is not a matter of free decision. What we hold for true is not entirely dependent on us, unlike Fantasia, which implies always a kind of emancipation from the given. Whereas doxa, opinion, is either a true or a false opinion about a state of affairs, about something which is out there, Fantasia is first of all what appears to us, independently to any of its truth values. Or, as he puts it in another passage, very interesting passage, Fantasia is something else than the affirmative or than the negative judgment. Unlike the propositional structure of the judgment, which is always a predication of something about something, of a quality about an object, the attribution or the negation of a predicate to a subject, ti, kata, tinos, as the Greek formula goes, the Fantasia does not have the structure of a two-value predication as P. And as such, it is intransitive. The phantasma does not stand for something else. It is not its representative or substitute, but at first hand nothing but the visual appearance of which we cannot say whether it is empirically in the world or not, whether it is true or false. Fantasia is that what puts a vision before the eye. In Greek, titenai pro omaton, in Latin, ante oculos ponere. This is also, by the way, what the ancient and medieval tradition of rhetorics will consider to be the highest value of the poet. The task of the poet is to provide this evidence, and evidence has to do with visibility, has to do with something which becomes clear to the mind's eye. The word for evidence is enargeia, clarity. All of these metaphorical ranges related to thinking, that's so interesting, are related to vision in the European languages. So the word for fantasia, the word for phantasma, has a root. So this is what I was talking about. The root for fantasia, the word for phantasma, is the root fa, which we find in many Indo-European languages. And this root fa we find in the word for light, phos, but also in phainomai, so being open, being patent, phanestai, appearing, also showing itself, manifesting, but also, and I think that's significant, phemi, which is the word, which is the verb to say, to publicize something, to make something publicly available, to speak out. So all of these dimensions have something to say with openness, with publicness, with visibility. It is thus true that the soul cannot think without phantasmata, but not because it would provide the nous, the intellect, with content, as the Einbildungskraft does for Kant, because in a way, rather, it can be said that the phantasmata accompany all the higher faculties. Fantasia is at play in abstract thinking, but also in geometrical calculations for memory's recollection, in anticipation what is yet to come, or, and that's interesting, I think, in ethical and political deliberations. That's what Aristotle calls the fantasia bouleotike. Even animals that do not have the faculty of thinking possess this basic capacity of visualizing, and consequently, the animal is not completely bound to what affects it. So there is already a distension, there's already something like time, there's already something like a primordial abstraction which comes into play even for those living beings who, according to Aristotle, have no rational capacity at all. But they have a capacity of abstracting themselves from what is going on, and that is called fantasia. This allows for a deliberation, this allows for taking decision, and this deliberate faculty of fantasia boulotike has to do with the social existence. A social existence which is not limited to human beings, but which is already characteristic of social animals, such as, these are the examples of Aristotle, bees and ants. Interestingly enough, Aristotle says that bees and ants possess fantasia. And those are also the animals that have among the most complex social organizations. This is a topic which would be worth delving into. But I won't discuss this now, but rather like to progressively now move towards the end and my conclusions in order for us to have a maximum of time for the discussion. So let me recall what I wanted to state here. Fantasia is not a synthesizing faculty. Fantasia is not a synthesizing faculty, is not meant to bridge a divide between the sensible and the intelligible, between aisthesis and noesis. It is not this medium faculty, this third faculty that needs to be introduced, simply because in an Aristotelian perspective, fantasia is not a faculty. I do not have the time here to do the complete demonstration. I would like to do it, but it is quite easy to show in the text why Aristotle, after initially thinking about the possibility of introducing something like a specific faculty of visualizing, gives up on this option. He renounces introducing fantasia as a specific faculty, and you can see this in the simple fact that fantasia does not have an object. All the faculties of the soul have a specific object. Perception is, aisthesis is related to the aisteton, the noesis to the noeton, the thinkable object, perceptible object, the sensible, and so on and so forth. And all the other faculties is the same, so the desire moves to something which is desired, the desired object. But what is the object of fantasia? As we said, there is no transitivity. So fantasia is not an object. It's not even a representative of an object. It is rather a force, a dynamic. So it would be possible to show, and I've done this elsewhere, but you have to trust me now simply, that this fantasia is indeed something which goes along with the higher faculties, but not as something separate. It is the aesthetic dimension of the higher faculties. It is the visualizing dimension of higher faculties. This is the only possible way to explain how we get from aisthesis to noesis, simply because in aisthesis as such, we have something in a latent way which will then only be intensified by the higher faculties of deliberation and of thinking, which is the fact that aisthesis as such creates differences in the sensible. Perception does not mean to simply being exposed to everything that comes in. Perception means structuring, means leaving out, means to leaving things aside. And the neurosciences simply confirm what the ancients knew, that we do not take all the optical impulses in, but already the retina selects and the neural process even more. So perception is, as such, an overlooking. Looking means to overlook. Looking means to leave aside, to concentrate. And fantasia does the same, only in a more radical way. And so it intensifies. Fantasia is the name of a force, of an intensification of this selective process. this is why fantasia has something to do with thinking. Fantasia is, believe it or not, on the side of abstraction. Fantasia is not on the side of colorful, fanciful play. It is on the side of abstraction. To leave out. And leaving out means fleshing out, means putting something to the fore, bringing something to the fore. So I think if we take this beautiful sentence by Merleau-Ponty in the Phenomenology of Perception, where he says, seeing is always to see more than we see, would perfectly fit to what Aristotle tries to say here. And especially beautiful texts, which are rarely read by philosophers, in his texts about natural history of the animals, and then also texts which are fascinating because they anticipate psychoanalysis maybe. In the Parva Naturalia, the interpretation of dreams, there is a text about the interpretation of dreams, and Freud said that this is the predecessor of psychoanalysis. Freud himself studied with a great Aristotelian in Vienna and considered Aristotle to be the predecessor, the ancestor of psychoanalysis. So in these texts about dreams, he remarks at one point that fantasia is not something which takes place only, when we close our eyes. It also takes place when we perceive. Unlike such certain positions, influential positions in 20th century, that of Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre's theory of imagination is that we only have imagination when we stop perceiving, either imagination or perception. Well, Aristotle says that fantasia traverses all this, and fantasia is at play when we perceive, simply because it works with those gaps which are already at play in aisthesis. It works with those gaps. It fills those gaps. It widens those gaps. It displaces those gaps. And he talks about the feverish patient. The feverish patient looks at the wall, just as Leonardo will describe the macchia later on, and he starts seeing things that are not there. He will see animals, says Aristotle. But the amazing thing about those animals is that, and the amazing thing about these visions, these hallucinations, is that they are not only pathological extreme cases. They tell us something about what fantasia is. And fantasia is not simply a capacity of the soul. It is beyond another divide, which is that of active and passive. It is a specifically medial force. I will explain what that means. So Aristotle says, I quote, "When the ill person is not too ill, he or she can play with his own visual creations." So we cannot come back into a state without hallucinations, but we can have an influence on those hallucinations. Similar states we can think of in half sleep. Proust has described, this moment between activity and passivity where things happen to us and yet we are part of it. We are the assistants in its most etymological sense. So we assist something coming into being. So going against the romantic credo of the artist as reaching out for emancipation when letting loose the free play of imagination, freed from any reproductive task, Aristotle's fantasia is neither a pure affection nor an affectivity which is entirely dependent on our free will, nor an activity which is entirely dependent on our free will. It is rather, as the strange formulation goes, an affection which is in our power. Pathos ephemin. So pathos is the affection, is that which affects us and which can become pathological in extreme cases. But this pathology is something which is in our power. Or this pathos, this effect is in our power. What is that to mean? An effect which is in our power. To explain what he means, Aristotle says that very often phantasmata appear to us when we close our eyes. Now, that seems to entail that if the power of summoning images does not consist in willfully projecting something in front of the inner eye, and you know that the word representation in German, Vorstellung, has this implication of putting something, projecting something in front of one's own eye, but rather to willfully suspend a capacity to use the sensorial faculties. So the potentiality of not doing, the potentiality of not actualizing one of our faculties, which is that of perceiving. By suspending momentarily this potentiality, something comes about. Something comes about, and in a way, we could say that we give way to what affects us. We give in to what overcomes us. Or using the words of a wonderful Aristotle commentator, we could say that the phantasmata is that which we are appeared to. And it might be noteworthy to stress that in classical Greek, the verb phantazestai, which is very old, goes back to Homer and also archaic Greek, this verb phantazestai exists almost exclusively in the middle voice. So you know, in Greek, they not only have active and passive, but they had a third voice, which is called the medium, which is neither active nor passive. And this middle voice is the formula used for the phantazestai. The visualizing soul, as it were, is neither agent nor patient, but rather a medium for the images that traverse it, and maybe not so unlike Éluard's conception of poetic creativity. Now, what does that imply for the relationship between fantasia and thinking? And I come back to the question that was asked to me by the organizers of this series. Well, certainly it is not about two separate faculties which would mingle now and then. Fantasia, that's what I would like to suggest, stands for a force rather than for a determined faculty, the force of producing an appearance which is unbound from the issue of its empirical givenness, as that which allows the grasp of to grasp the form without the matter is literally an apheiresis. This is the word which has then produced our word abstraction. Abstraction, apheiresis, a desolidarization from the given. The abstractive fleshing out is a dynamic process and not a formulaic mechanism. As a force which gives us something to see, even in absence of any empirical visible thing, the fantasia allows for the soul's free action. Thinking is not what needs to be filled with any empirical content in order not to remain empty. It is rather radicalization of what it is at work in a process of fantasia, a progressive abstraction from what is towards what appears, from ontology to phenomenology. While fantasia sets in by making holes and gaps in the fabric of the sensible, which it will explore and fill in its own way, noesis, thinking, is still phantasmatic in the sense that it just expands those holes to turn them into the fabric as such. Nietzsche imagined a similar genealogy for abstraction, and I will finish with this. This is from the posthumous notes. Conscious thinking, he says, is nothing but a process of selecting images. It is a long way from this to abstraction. Firstly, the power which produces the profusion of images. Secondly, the power which selects and emphasizing what is similar. Fever patients, and I think we have to think that he read Aristotle, fever patients proceed this way. It's just that the healthy ones project the wallpaper too. Thank you very much.